Hi, I'm Lady Novelist. I'm a print journalist and former radio journalist. I've written a couple of short stories for you, which I've put together into a compilation. They are stories about unusual happenings, some scary, some from which each of us can learn something. Listen to them and enjoy them. And if you like, subscribe to my channel where I post at least one video with a new short story every week. Elaine Jefferson had lived in the crooked stone cottage on the hill since her husband passed, a reclusive widow and silent presence that the village preferred to keep at a distance. Her cottage was weather-beaten and ancient, surrounded by a tangle of overgrown brambles and vines that seemed to protect it like a natural fortress. Though Elaine was neither witch nor healer, the townsfolk had let superstitions take root, fed by her unusual looks, bent frame, clawed hands, eyes that shone like flints in a fire. With nothing left to anchor her to the town below, Elaine had little reason to mingle with its people. She lived quietly, accepting their judgment as a strange, twisted form of peace. Children, when daring each other, would rush up the path to her house, only to flee back to their parents, breathless with imagined terror. "She's a witch," they'd whisper, caught up in tales spun by parents who'd grown up believing the same thing. She didn't mind. It was better to be left alone than harassed. And though the tales painted her as a dangerous creature, she was content to let them linger. One late autumn afternoon, the village children were playing in the woods that stretched near the base of Elaine's hill. 7-year-old Cindy, a curious and fearless girl with tousled curls, was playing hide-and-seek with her friends. As she ducked under branches and skipped over roots, she hardly noticed the deepening gray of the sky or the shivering wind that slipped through the trees, whispering of rain. When the storm hit, it came without warning. A sharp, icy rain whipped through the woods, and the winds were strong enough to shake branches loose. Cindy's friends scattered in a rush, crying out to each other as they ran back toward the village, but Cindy, lost in the thick of the trees, went in the wrong direction. As she stumbled blindly through the underbrush, she slipped on wet leaves and tumbled down a steep embankment, her foot catching on a gnarled root. She felt a sharp, blinding pain shoot through her leg and screamed. She lay on the ground, rain drumming down on her as the sky roared and flashed with lightning. She tried to crawl, but her leg refused to move, agony shooting through her every time she tried. Terrified, Cindy cried out for her parents, for her friends, but only the storm answered back. It was nearly dark when Elaine heard the cries. Reluctantly, she picked up her lantern and made her way down the hill, following the faint, weakening voice. It didn't take her long to find Cindy, shivering and drenched, her ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. The girl looked up at Elaine in horror as she approached, the pale eyes and crooked smile confirming every fear that had been instilled in her young mind. But Elaine had never been a cruel woman, despite her solitude. She crouched down beside Cindy, her voice a soft, raspy murmur. "Don't be afraid. I won't harm you, child. We need to get you out of this rain." Cindy, still trembling, nodded, unable to argue as the pain in her leg overpowered her fright. Elaine lifted her as gently as she could, feeling the girl's small body stiffen, and carried her up the muddy slope to her cottage on the hill. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the earthy smell of dried herbs and wood smoke. Elaine laid Cindy on a rough but clean cot by the hearth, covered her with a thick woolen blanket, and began inspecting the injury. The girl winced, clutching the blanket, as Elaine spoke in gentle tones, explaining that her leg was badly sprained but not broken. "This will hurt, but it'll help," Elaine murmured as she prepared a poultice. She crushed herbs with a practiced hand, spreading the mixture over Cindy's swollen ankle. It burned at first, but soon Cindy felt a strange coolness as the pain dulled. Elaine bandaged the ankle carefully and placed a steaming mug of herbal tea beside the bed. "Drink, it'll calm you," she said, a faint smile flickering over her lips. Hours passed and the storm died down, though the wind still howled in the trees outside. Elaine sat beside Cindy, her wrinkled hands knitting, while the girl drifted in and out of sleep. She had never imagined this old woman as anything but a monstrous figure. Now she saw her as an ordinary person, just weathered by age, her movements slow but tender. Eventually, after a long silence, Cindy whispered, "Thank you." Elaine nodded, her eyes distant. "I've had my share of injuries, child. Living alone, you learn to mend yourself." In the early hours of dawn, the girl's parents came searching, desperate and frantic, led by a group of villagers holding torches and weapons as though hunting a beast. When they reached the cottage, the crowd stopped in its tracks, fearful to cross Elaine's doorstep. Cindy's father, George, pushed his way to the front, his voice loud and full of accusation. "What have you done with our daughter, witch?" he demanded. Elaine opened the door, her face shadowed by the faint light of dawn behind her. She did not flinch at the accusation. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing them to see the child resting peacefully in her cot. Cindy's mother, Betty, rushed inside, gathering her daughter in her arms with tears streaming down her face. But George still eyed Elaine with suspicion, his jaw tight. "What spell did you put on her?" he demanded. Elaine's voice was calm, though a hint of sadness edged it. "No spells here, George, just herbs and care. The girl was injured. I did what anyone would." One of the older villagers, a man named Tom, looked around the cottage, frowning as if trying to spot any hint of dark magic. But he saw only the simple tools of a healer: dried herbs, clay pots, neatly arranged bandages. He cleared his throat, catching George's arm. "George," he said quietly, "seems like she saved the girl." George's face softened slightly as he took in the room, then his gaze turned to Elaine. For the first time he noticed how frail she looked, how her shoulders sagged under the weight of loneliness. As the villagers whispered among themselves, Elaine simply watched, waiting for them to leave. Finally, Cindy's mother turned to her, her voice shaky. "Thank you for what you did. We would have lost her without you." Elaine offered only a nod. "Go on now. The girl needs rest." The villagers left the cottage, their heads lowered in shame or unease, unwilling to look Elaine in the eye. As they made their way back down the hill, they whispered to each other, the old tales of witches and curses beginning to unravel in the light of morning. A week passed before Cindy's family sent word up the hill, asking if Elaine would come down to the village. They had gathered by the well, the entire town waiting in quiet anticipation, though Elaine knew they still carried traces of fear. George was the first to speak. "We were wrong, Elaine. About you." He looked down, the weight of guilt clear in his voice. "You saved our girl. We should have known better than to believe tales spun out of fear." Elaine studied their faces, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin and the faint hum of voices she'd missed for so long. "Fear is a strong thing," she said, voice as steady as a stone. "It can make good people do foolish things." Betty stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "You've been a neighbor to us all these years, and we've treated you as anything but. We want to make it right." Elaine glanced at their open faces. For the first time in years, she felt something shift within her, a thaw after a long winter. She took Betty's hand, shaking it briefly, her smile faint but genuine. The children who had huddled behind their parents peeked out, watching with wide eyes. Cindy, her ankle still wrapped but healing, took a bold step forward, her young voice breaking the silence. "Thank you, Miss Elaine," she said, her voice strong, "for taking care of me. I was scared, but you helped me." Elaine's heart softened at the girl's words. "You're a brave child, Cindy, braver than most." After that day, the village's tales of witches and curses faded into memory. Elaine no longer lived as a feared recluse, but as a respected healer. Though she still preferred her solitude on the hill, the villagers found themselves seeking her advice, her remedies, her steady hands in times of need, and over the years the children came to know her not as a witch, but as old Miss Elaine. And they all carried a lesson, taught by an unlikely friendship, that stories, especially those born of fear, were seldom true, and that truth was found only by facing one's fears with open eyes and an open heart. The Transylvanian sky was a muted canvas of grey clouds drifting lazily above the rolling hills and dense forests. For Radu, the young soldier trudging along the cobblestone path, the day felt even darker. His heart weighed heavy in his chest, his thoughts as turbulent as the distant mountains. The army had become an unbearable burden. Every day was a relentless cycle of grueling training, barking officers, and cold, sleepless nights. He had thought he could handle it, at least until he'd received the letter that shattered his heart. Maria, the girl he had loved for as long as he could remember, was engaged, and not to him. The ink on the parchment was still fresh in his mind. The news felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. Her promises of waiting for him, of being together once his training was over, had turned to lies. She was to marry Florin, the baker's son, a boy who had never known the hardship of the army, who had stayed behind while Radu was shipped off to train for a conflict that seemed more distant by the day. Radu had always found solace in the small Catholic church at the heart of a little village not far away from his military unit. Its bell tower stood like a silent sentinel over the village, a modest structure of stone and wood nestled at the front of the Carpathian Mountains. Every Sunday before he left for training, he had attended Mass there, kneeling in the hard pews and watching the light from the stained glass window dance on the altar. It had been his sanctuary. Now he sought it for a different reason. After Mass, Radu slipped away from the others, unnoticed, as the elderly priest gave his final blessings. He climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the bell tower, his boots echoing in the empty stairwell. His breath was ragged, his hands trembling. The gun at his side felt heavier than it ever had. He reached the top where the wooden beams creaked beneath his weight. The view of the village below was peaceful, the thatched roofs of the houses blending into the mist that hung over the hills. The smell of incense still lingered in his nose from the Mass, mixing with the scent of aged wood. But none of it brought him peace. "This is the end," he whispered to himself, fingers brushing the cold metal of his pistol. He had made his decision. He couldn't go back to the army, not after this. And Maria had betrayed him. The pistol shook in his hand as he raised it to his temple. His heart pounded and he closed his eyes, whispering a final prayer. "Please forgive me." Before he could pull the trigger, a soft voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't do that." Radu's eyes snapped open, his finger freezing on the trigger. He turned startled, and there, standing in the corner of the tower, was a young girl. She was dressed simply, her long dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, the color of storm clouds before rain, filled with an old mixture of sorrow and understanding. "Who?" Radu stammered, lowering the gun. How did you?" She stepped forward, her expression calm, though her voice carried a gentle urgency. "I saw you come in. I followed. I didn't want you to be alone." Radu blinked, still in shock. "Who are you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she came closer, her eyes never leaving his. "There's more for you than this," she said softly, gesturing to the pistol in his hand. "This isn't your path." Radu swallowed hard, his grip on the gun loosening. Her presence was like a balm to his tortured soul. He hadn't expected to find anyone here, let alone someone who seemed to know exactly what he was feeling. He searched her face, looking for some sign of how she could understand. "Why should I listen to you?" he asked, though his voice had lost its edge. "Because I know," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I know what it feels like to lose everything. But it's not the end, Radu. It never is." He hadn't told her his name. The realization startled him, but before he could question it, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his. Her touch was warm, and for a moment Radu felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Go back," she urged him. "Finish what you started. The pain will fade and you'll find your way again." Radu stared at her, his chest tightening with emotion. He didn't know why, but something about her words, her presence, made him believe her. Slowly he lowered the pistol, his hand shaking as he tucked it back into its holster. The girl smiled, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to hold secrets beyond her years. "Good," she said simply, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the narrow stairwell. Radu stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had stood. He felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but she had saved his life. And for some reason, she had known exactly how to do it. 3 months later, Radu returned to his home village. The army training had been hard, but he had pushed through, driven by the memory of that girl in the bell tower. Her words had stayed with him, echoing in his mind during the long nights and grueling days. And now, at last, he was home. The village was just as he had left it, small, quiet, and nestled in the shadow of the mountains. The church bell chimed as he walked down the familiar streets, greeting old neighbors and friends. It was Sunday, and the church was filled with the usual people. Radu found his seat near the back, as he always did, and bowed his head in prayer. But something felt different today. As the mass went on, he found his gaze drifting toward the front of the church where a lone girl sat. She was young, her dark hair cascading down her back, and she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. There was something about her that tugged at Radu's memory, though he couldn't quite place it. His friend Petru leaned over and whispered in his ear, "Do you see her?" Radu nodded slightly. "Who is she?" "They say she came back from the dead," Petru murmured, his voice low. "She was ill, deathly ill, just a few months ago. Everyone thought she was gone, but then she recovered, miraculously, they say." Radu's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened as he took a closer look at the girl. She was too far away for him to see her face clearly, but something about her posture, her presence, felt hauntingly familiar. The mass ended, and as the villagers began to leave, Radu stayed in his seat, watching the girl as she rose and made her way toward the door. She moved with a quiet grace, her head bowed slightly. Radu stood, his heart racing, and followed her outside. He caught up to her just as she reached the foot of the bell tower, a place very similar to the one where he had almost taken his life 3 months ago. She turned slightly, and when her eyes met his, Radu felt a shock of recognition. It was her, the girl from the tower. "You!" His voice faltered as he stepped closer. "You were there, in the tower, that day." She smiled softly. The same knowing smile she had given him before. "I told you," she said quietly. "There's more for you than what you see right now." Radu's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes soft and filled with something that seemed almost otherworldly. Then, without answering, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist that clung to the village streets. Radu stood there, breathless, watching her vanish into the fog. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of awe and confusion swirling inside him. He didn't know who she was, but he eagerly wanted to know her better, for she had once saved his life. On the edge of a small village, perched atop a lonely hill, stood an old creaking house that had seen better days. Its paint was peeling, its windows fogged with age, and the wild vines that clung to its walls whispered secrets to the wind. This was the home of 12-year-old Sam, a boy whose life was woven with shadows. His face and body bore the scars of a fire that had engulfed him when he was just 5, leaving him with deep burns and a body that moved with a painful limp. His grandmother Erica was his only companion, a fierce protector who often reminded him that beauty was not defined by appearances. The village kids had always kept their distance, whispering tales of a haunted house and the monster that lived within. They teased, laughed, and pointed, convinced that the boy in the house was as terrifying as the stories suggested. With every jeer and every snicker, Sam felt the walls of his world grow tighter. School had become unbearable, and after a few months of enduring the laughter and rejection, he decided to stay home, hidden away with his books and the memories of a life before the fire. On Halloween, the village was alive with laughter and excitement. Children donned costumes of all shapes and sizes, their faces painted like ghosts, witches, and superheroes. As the sun dipped low, casting an orange glow over the hills, a group of particularly mischievous boys gathered near the base of Sam's hill. They were armed with plans to scare him, to prove to themselves that they could conquer the fears they had been fed for years. "Let's go to the haunted house," one of them shouted, bravado fueling his voice. "But what if he sees us?" Another hesitated, glancing up the hill where the darkened windows seemed to stare back. "Nah, he's probably hiding. Just a freak, come on." They all laughed, egging each other as they trudged up the rocky path. As they reached the top, Sam sat in his room reading a book about knights and dragons, a world far removed from his own. He didn't hear the boys approaching until their laughter broke the stillness of his home. He looked up, his heart racing, wondering if they would dare to come any closer. Suddenly one of the boys shouted, "Hey monster, we brought you a treat," and tossed a rotten pumpkin over the fence. Sam's heart sank. He recognized the tones. He had heard them before. He wanted to ignore them, to hide away beneath his blankets, but something within him flickered, a longing for connection, for friendship, despite the pain of rejection. Gathering his courage, he opened his window slightly, enough to let out a whisper, "Leave me alone." Just then a commotion erupted as one of the boys, Jake, stumbled and lost his balance. In an instant he was tumbling toward the ancient well that stood at the edge of Sam's yard, hidden by overgrown weeds and shadows. The laughter turned to screams as Jake fell, splashing into the murky water below. "Jake!" the boys shouted, panic erupting in their voices as they rushed to the edge of the well. They peered down, horrified to see their friend struggling against the water, his cries echoing upward. In that moment, all thoughts of revenge vanished, replaced by a primal fear, The boys turned and fled down the hill, leaving Jake behind. Sam's heart raced as he heard the commotion. He had spent so long in isolation that the sound of anyone in distress stirred something deep within him. He couldn't just stand by. He grabbed a sturdy rope that his grandmother had kept for repairs, his hands trembling not from fear but from determination. He rushed to the well, peering over the edge. "Jake," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hold on, I'm coming." Jake's head bobbed just above the surface, panic-stricken eyes searching the darkness above. "Help! Get me out of here!" Taking a deep breath, Sam secured the rope around a sturdy post near the well, his heart thudding in his chest. "I'm going to throw this down. Grab it." He flung the rope down, watching as it landed just out of Jake's reach. "You have to swim over to it." With sheer desperation, Jake managed to paddle toward the rope, clenching it tightly when he finally reached it. Sam's hands shook as he pulled, feeling the strain of his small body against the weight of Jake. "Hold on, I won't let you go." With every ounce of strength, Sam pulled until he felt the weight shift, and finally Jake emerged, drenched and gasping, clinging to the rope. With one final heave, Sam pulled him to safety, and Jake tumbled onto the ground, coughing and sputtering. The moment they were free from the well, a heavy silence settled. Sam looked at Jake, whose face was streaked with mud and fear. The other boys stood at a distance, their faces pale with shock. Sam could hear their whispers, unsure of what to say or do. Why did you help me?" Jake asked, his voice shaky as he pushed himself up. "Because it's the right thing to do," Sam replied, surprising even himself with the steadiness of his voice. "You were in trouble." The boys now huddled together, watching with wide eyes. Sam's heart pounded, knowing that their perceptions of him were shifting in real time. It was a moment he had never anticipated, a bridge forming between his world and theirs. "I'm sorry for what we did," Jake stammered, his voice thick with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to be brave." "Brave isn't about scaring people," Sam said softly, his gaze steady. "It's about helping others, even if they look different." The other boys exchanged glances, the fear that had once kept them at bay now replaced by a strange sense of kinship. They approached cautiously, Jake leading the way. Can we be friends?" Sam's heart fluttered at the possibility. "You mean it?" "Yeah," Jake said, his eyes earnest. "You saved my life. I was wrong to judge you." The silence that hung in the air felt transformative. Sam took a tentative step forward, and the other boys joined him, their apprehension melting away. They began to talk, sharing stories and laughter, finding common ground beyond their differences. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hill, Sam realized that he had not only rescued Jake, but had also freed himself from the chains of solitude. The laughter of children filled the air, echoing against the haunted walls of his home, transforming the darkness into light. From that day forward, the village began to see Sam differently. No longer just the boy with the scars, he became a friend. A reminder that true beauty resides in kindness, courage, and the connections we forge with one another. The stories of the haunted house faded, replaced by tales of friendship and bravery. And as Sam looked out from his hill, he understood that sometimes it takes a leap into the unknown to discover the light within. This is a story that had happened to me long time ago. It happened 1 year after my grandfather passed. He had been like a father to me because he and my grandmother raised me from the time when I was a baby girl. So his loss hit me hard. I started to run regularly because it kept my mind sane. Running heals. Sports can be indeed a little bit of therapy sometime. It was Friday evening. Another week was nearly over and I eagerly wanted to get rid of the tension at work. The crisp evening air clung to my skin as I stretched by the park entrance, the dry scent of autumn leaves drifting through the wind. My muscles hummed, anticipating the run ahead. As a dedicated runner, I thrived on these evening workouts, finding solace in the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement and the cool air filling my lungs. Tonight, like so many nights before, the world outside the park felt distant, unimportant. It was just me, the path, and the thrill of the run. I wasn't afraid. My city was a safe city. It was safe running in the streets, no matter what time. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a dim twilight that seeped into the early darkness. The sky above was a velvety stretch of stars, and the trees lining the path were skeletal, their once vibrant leaves crinkling underfoot like a carpet of memories from a more colorful season. I set my pace, and the familiar sound of my running shoes hitting the ground became immediately a comforting rhythm. I wore my best gear, lightweight, reflective, and sleek, making me feel like I could outrun the night itself. The air, cooler than usual, bit at my cheeks, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. My mind drifted, as it often did when I ran, to the upcoming marathon in 2 weeks. I had been training relentlessly since my grandfather passed, pushing my limits with every run. It was always about the finish line, never about running times. I wanted eagerly to finish the marathon. As I picked up my pace, something odd pricked at my senses. A strange sensation, like eyes watching me from the shadows. I glanced around, my breath fogging the air and my glasses, but I saw nothing. Just the silhouettes of barren trees and the dim glow of distant streetlights. I brushed it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination. Actually, I was used to running at night, and despite the deserted path, I had never felt uneasy before. Tonight, though, something was different. The wind picked up swirling leaves in tiny cyclones at my feet, and I felt an inexplicable chill crawl up my spine. I glanced behind me, my heart rate quickening, but there was no one there. It was just me, alone with the darkness, the distant hum of traffic on the main road, the only sound beyond my own breathing. When I ran at night, I never listened to music. I wanted to be aware of my surroundings. A flash of light caught my eye. My breath hitched. Far up ahead, just where the path bent towards the main road, headlights gleamed, throwing long shadows across the ground. I blinked. A car moving fast swerved onto the running path. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't slowing down. The vehicle, a dark jeep, roared through the night, its engine a beastly growl that shattered the stillness. My body reacted before my mind did. I leaped to the side, my foot catching a loose patch of gravel, sending me sprawling toward the edge of the road. The car zoomed past, missing me by centimeters, the gust of wind from its passing throwing my hair across my face. My palms scraped against the cold asphalt as I tried to push myself up, but my body felt heavy, weighed down by the adrenaline crashing through my veins. Breathing heavily, I turned to watch the car's taillights disappear into the night. My body trembled, my heart still in my throat. How close had I been to death? I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but the world around me seemed to spin, the shadows thicker, darker. "Are you all right?" a man's voice asked, soft and deep. I jolted, my eyes snapping open. Coming out of the blue, a man was standing beside me, his face shrouded by the dim light. He was tall, his presence commanding, yet strangely calming at the same time. I hadn't seen him approach, hadn't even heard footsteps. I think so, I stammered, clutching my scraped palms. Where did you come from? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched behind me, his gaze lingering on the spot where the car had almost hit me. There was something unsettling about him, but not in the way a stranger might be. His features were sharp, yet there was a softness to his eyes, as though he held the weight of centuries behind him. His dark long coat fluttered lightly in the breeze, and for a brief second I thought I saw something glimmer behind him. He wore a hat, exactly like the one my grandfather used to wear. I think he was around 55 or something like that. You were very lucky, the man said finally, his voice low. The car missed you by mere centimeters. I know, I muttered with a shaky voice. I didn't even hear it until it was almost on me. He nodded, his gaze distant. You shouldn't be running this late, he said. Something about his tone made me pause. It wasn't a warning, it was more like a fact, like he had known all along that danger would find me. I tried to scan his face, to place him, but I couldn't. He seemed familiar in a way that made no sense, like a figure out of a half-forgotten dream. Who are you? I asked, standing up slowly, brushing dirt from my knees. The man followed my movements, rising gracefully. He smiled, a sad, almost melancholic smile. Raluca, you know who I am. My stomach twisted at the sound of my name. I hadn't told him that. The man took a step closer, his presence enveloping me like the night itself. I've been with you for a long time. Every run, every race, every mile you push yourself to the edge. I've watched, always ready to catch you before you fall. His eyes softened, and again I saw the faintness flicker of something behind him, shimmering in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The air seemed to grow heavier around me, the world narrowing until it was just the two of us, the night pressing in like a cloak. I wanted to say something, but the words stuck in my throat as the truth of it washed over me. He was right. In some deep, inexplicable part of my soul, I knew. All those times I had felt eyes watching me on my runs, the inexplicable moments of safety when I should have fallen, the strange sense of calm during races. He had been there all along. The man watched my reaction with quiet understanding. You weren't supposed to be hurt tonight. I couldn't let that happen. I swallowed, my mind spinning. Why did you show yourself? I catched myself saying. His gaze flicked to the road where the car had vanished. The danger tonight was different. I couldn't stay hidden. If I hadn't intervened, that car wouldn't have stopped. I shivered, the weight of what could have been sinking in. But why are you protecting me? He smiled again, a soft, knowing smile. Because you have more miles to go, more races to run. Your story isn't over yet. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves. For a moment, everything felt surreal, like I was caught between two worlds. The ordinary life I had known and something far beyond it. I looked up at him, trying to make sense of the moment. I wanted to ask him if I would ever see him again, but the words were stuck in my throat. I didn't feel fear. I felt very safe in the presence of that man, of that guardian angel of mine. His expression softened, and for the briefest second I thought I saw the flicker of wings again, dark and ethereal. Perhaps, he said, as if he was answering a question I haven't been able to ask. And with that he turned, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. I just stood there, my heart still racing, the night around me somehow feeling different. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never ever run alone again. crisp air of the mountains was refreshing as Evelyn and Harry cruised along the winding road, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley. They had been looking forward to this getaway for months, escaping the buzz of the city, immersing themselves in the tranquility of nature, and rediscovering the simplicity of being together. Their destination was a charming little hotel tucked away in the hills, recommended by an old travel blog Evelyn had stumbled across on the internet. It was called Sunset Hotel. They arrived just as the sky was blushing with the hues of sunset. The hotel loomed before them, an old stone structure that seemed oddly out of place amidst the lush greenery of the forest. Its architecture was more reminiscent of a bygone era, a grand manor that had somehow ended up at the edge of the world. Ivy climbed its walls, and the windows were dark, almost reflective in their stillness. Harry parked the car in the small gravel lot, and they both stepped out, gazing at the building with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Harry asked, glancing at Evelyn with a raised eyebrow. Evelyn checked her phone. "Yeah, this is it. It looks quaint." Her voice had an edge of uncertainty that matched his own. They walked up the creaking steps to the front door. The wood was weathered, the brass doorknob tarnished and cold. Evelyn reached out to open it, and the heavy door swung inward with a low groan before she could touch it. The air inside was thick and musty. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, though the light it gave off was dim and uneven. The lobby was furnished with antique chairs and faded rugs, giving the whole space a timeless, forgotten feeling. A massive wooden desk stood at the far end. Behind it sat a man with sharp features, his skin pale, almost ashen. His dark hair was slicked back, and his deep-set eyes followed them as they approached. "Welcome," he said, his voice soft but carrying a strange echo. "You must be Mr. and Mrs. Sheffer." Evelyn opened her mouth to correct him. They weren't married, but something about the way he said it stopped her. She simply nodded. "Your room is ready," he continued, not looking away. "Room 13 on the second floor." "Thank you," Harry said quickly, feeling the need to fill the silence that seemed to stretch uncomfortably. The man handed them a brass key, the number 13 etched into it, and then pointed towards the staircase. As they climbed up the stairs, the sensation of being watched crawled over Evelyn's skin. She glanced behind her, expecting to see the man at the desk still staring at them, but the lobby was empty. A strange heavy silence filled the hotel, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the wooden stairs. Room 13 was at the end of a narrow hallway. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, peeling at the edges. Harry unlocked the door, and they stepped into their room. It was large, with high ceilings, and a canopy bed draped in heavy dark curtains. The furniture, like everything else in the hotel, looked old, worn, yet somehow untouched by time. Evelyn wandered to the window and pulled back the thick velvet curtains. The view was stunning, the vast mountain range bathed in the soft glow of twilight. But something about the stillness of the forest below unsettled her. There was no movement, no sound, not even the wind rustling the trees. No bird was chirping. It was just a weird silence that made her blood run cold in her veins. "I guess it's kind of charming," Harry said, setting their bags down and flopping onto the bed. The mattress creaked ominously under his weight. Evelyn turned away from the window, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's got character," she said. But deep down she felt something was off. She couldn't shake the strange vibe of the place, as if the hotel itself was watching them, waiting for something. It was just a bad, bad feeling. As night fell, the atmosphere inside the hotel grew more oppressive. After a long day of travel, they decided to call it an early night, but sleep was elusive. Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the old building. Harry snored lightly beside her, his arm draped over her waist, but even his warmth didn't comfort her. At some point during the night, a distant howl pierced the silence. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She sat up, listening. The howl came again, long, mournful, and closer this time. "Harry, did you hear that?" she whispered, shaking him awake. "Hear what?" he mumbled groggily. The howl rose once more, this time accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their door. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They moved with an unnatural rhythm, like someone or something was dragging itself along. Harry sat up, his eyes wide now, fully awake. He listened, his face growing pale as the footsteps neared their door, then stopped just outside. The doorknob rattled. Evelyn's breath hitched. She clutched Harry's arm, and they both stared at the door, waiting, frozen with fear. But nothing happened. The doorknob stopped moving, and the footsteps continued down the hall, fading into silence once more. "What the hell is going on?" Harry whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know, but I don't like it," Evelyn replied, her heart pounding. "We should leave. First thing in the morning," Harry agreed. "We're getting out of here." The rest of the night passed in a tense, sleepless haze. Every creak, every distant sound put them on edge, but nothing else disturbed their door. By the time dawn broke, a pale light filtering through the heavy curtains, they were both exhausted. They packed their bags in silence, eager to leave the eerie hotel behind. When they stepped into the hallway, it was deathly quiet, more so than it had been the night before. The light fixtures flickered weakly overhead. As they made their way downstairs, the sense of wrongness deepened. The wallpaper on the walls had peeled back further, revealing mold and cracks in the wood beneath. The air smelled damp and rotten. When they reached the lobby, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The grand chandelier that once hung from the ceiling now lay shattered on the floor, shards of glass scattered across the faded carpet. The front desk was abandoned, the once polished wood now dull and cracked. "Harry, what happened?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like this place aged overnight." Harry didn't respond. He was staring out the front door, his face pale. Evelyn followed his gaze and gasped. The forest outside was no longer lush and green. It was dark and twisted, the trees gnarled and bare, as if winter had come overnight. The sky was an overcast gray, and a strange mist hung over the ground, swirling ominously around the base of the hotel. "I don't understand," Harry said, his voice barely audible. Evelyn grabbed his hand. "We need to get out of here." They rushed to the front door, but as they pushed it open, the air outside was cold and biting, a stark contrast to the warmth of the previous day. They hurried to their car, but the gravel lot was empty, no sign of their vehicle. Panic rose in Evelyn's chest. "Where's the car, Harry? Where's the car?" "It was right here," Harry stammered, his eyes wide with fear. He turned in circles, searching for any sign of it, but the lot was deserted, as if their car had never been there. "We have to find someone," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Maybe there's another way out of here." But as they turned back to the hotel, they realized that the building itself seemed to be deteriorating before their eyes. The stone walls were crumbling, the windows shattered. Vines and moss grew thick along the facade, as if the forest had begun reclaiming it. The front door, once so heavy and imposing, now hung crookedly on its hinges. "We need to get inside," Harry muttered, pulling Evelyn towards the door. But when they re-entered the lobby, it was as though they had stepped into a ruin. The floorboards were rotting, and the furniture was broken and decayed. There was no sign of life, no trace of the strange man who had greeted them the day before. "This can't be real," Evelyn whispered. Harry looked around, his face pale. "We need to find another way out. Come on." They hurried through the crumbling hotel, searching for an exit, but every door they tried led them back into the decaying halls. The windows were sealed, impossible to open. The oppressive sense of being trapped weighed heavier with each passing minute. Just as Evelyn was about to give in to despair, they heard the faint sound of footsteps again, this time behind them. They spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing through the ruined hotel, and then from the shadows a voice whispered, low and chilling, "You were never meant to leave." With adrenaline pumping, they somehow managed to open a door and ran into the woods, eventually finding the main road where they could be picked up by a passing car. When they called the police and returned the next day to the same spot, there was not even a ruin of the Sunset Hotel. Suddenly, Harry stumbled on something. Looking down, he found an old doorknob, identical to the one from the horror room they had stayed in just 2 days before. This is a story my grandmother, who lived in a Romanian village in Transylvania, told me a long time ago. Everybody knows that the legend of Dracula has its origin in Transylvania, a miraculous land where other fantastic creatures would live, such as fairies called Iele, water monsters, or even werewolves. Because I can't remember all the details of the story, I wrote a text that combines the real and the imaginary. I leave it to the audience to decide what might be real and what might be pure imagination. And the story goes like this. Anna and John had been together for a year when they decided to get married. They were the most beautiful and envied couple in the village. She, a young seamstress, blonde, blue-eyed, slender, with a soft voice, and he, a rebellious young man with brown hair and jet black eyes, a mountain of a man, strong, fearless. It seemed as if the most successful specimens of the Homo sapiens race had mated, at least in the idyllic little Transylvanian village where the two protagonists of my story lived. I'm sure their love was the envy of many. What did he see in her? Some of the village girls wondered, and the men, some of them, sighed in sadness. Oh, what a beauty of a woman John has found. Anna and John had a fairy tale wedding, which, though it lasted only a day and a night, brought almost the whole village together around their love story. The villagers celebrated with wine and fine food, and the pipers made the music reverberate throughout most of the gorge of the river that flowed there. Nothing seemed to stand in the way of their happiness. Anna was working from home, and John was a blacksmith who went to work every day. He worked in a trade, making wrought iron gates, tools, and other useful things. But dark clouds were gathering over their marriage. Not half a year into their marriage, rumors began circulating in the village that John had a mistress. Sometimes the villagers would see him walking in the woods alone, but probably with a hidden purpose. It was believed that John was meeting another girl from the village. Nobody knew who the secret mistress could be. The women began to whisper behind her back when Anna passed in the street, and the men even seemed annoyed, not understanding why a woman as beautiful as Anna was not enough for him. It's clear that beauty and perfection become boring with time. They don't say that for nothing. No matter how good she looks, no matter how sweet she talks, someone somewhere is tired of putting up with her shit. And that's probably how it was, or at least that's what they thought about those two. Anna and John had started arguing. Of course, in a small village, rumors travel fast and eventually reach those involved. To make sure this was the case, Anna followed John to his workplace one day and stayed at a neighbor's house who lived nearby so she could see what he was up to from the window. She had also slept very poorly at night, the full moon making her more sensitive and restless. After a couple of hours of John working in the trade, she saw him coming out the door. She followed him from a distance to see where he went. And surprise, John went straight to the woods and plunged into it. It was clear John had a mistress. Anna stormed home, determined to hold him to account once he got home. The afternoon came and John returned home. It was a warm, pleasant, late fall day. The sun still had strength, and the leaves of the trees had colored yellow, red, and orange. A few were still green. The forest's feast of the colors could have gladdened any heart, but Anna's heart was broken. "Where have you been?" she asked in a scolding tone. "I was at work," John replied calmly. "You're lying. You went to the woods to meet your girlfriend," Anna shouted at him. John glared at her with eyes flashing with anger. His hair ruffled on his body, and he replied angrily, "I'm gone. I can't live with you. If you believe all the lies, I have nothing more to discuss with you." But Anna didn't give in. "It's not rumors. I saw it with my own eyes. You went into the woods. What were you doing there?" She held him responsible. "Oh, so now you're stalking me. Fine, I'm gone. I have nothing more to discuss with you," he replied, as if snarling through his teeth. John got up from the table, the chair he'd been sitting on tipped over, and he disappeared out the door. It must have been a wise decision to leave, otherwise they would certainly have had a very bad row, and who knows where they would have ended up. Verbal violence can always turn into physical violence. Anna was left alone. Bitter tears streamed down her angry red cheeks. She could not believe that the man she had once loved so much and still loved had betrayed her trust. She was sad, angry. After crying like that for about an hour, she decided to wipe her tears. John was not the only man in the world. She was young and aware of her beauty. She looked in the mirror. The flowered dress made her look even more beautiful. She decided to mind her own business, to take her mind off her thoughts. There was mown hay in the garden that Anna wanted to collect. As a housewife, she didn't shirk the hard labor of housework. She looked frail, but she was strong in every way. So she picked up her pitchfork and began to gather the mown and dried hay from the garden. Their house was on the edge of the forest. A light wind was blowing, but it was not cold, it was really warm. Summer still had a little power to warm the earth, the air, and her. As she worked like this, she suddenly heard an ominous growl. Looking around, she saw a large wolf preparing to attack her. Anna gasped. The animal was huge, fierce, with large, sharp fangs. Suddenly, it leaped at her. Anna swung her pitchfork at it, wounding it on the back. But the wolf didn't give up. The fight went on for several minutes, during which time the animal tore at her beautiful flowery summer dress, but failed to bite her. She instead wounded him on the back and managed to make him flee into the bushes. Exhausted and frightened, she ran into the house and closed the door behind her. The danger seemed gone, or so she thought. After a couple of hours, during which Anna had changed and calmed down, John appeared home. She breathlessly told him about her encounter with the wolf, how she had wrestled with it and managed to make it disappear back into the woods. They were both much calmer and discussed their problems. They ate dinner together quietly, and Anna thought that maybe her man really wasn't lying to her. He had told her that he had gone to the forest to help the forester identify the animal that had apparently been causing trouble for other villagers. The big wolf that had attacked Anna had become a real problem for the village and had to be caught and killed. And John, being a strong man, had gotten into act. Anna was quiet. At night, when they went to bed, John went first to take a shower. When he undressed, Anna saw his back. He had 3 deep cuts where the blood had already clotted. Anna shuddered. What had happened to her husband? Seeing the deep wounds on his back, The image of the wolf she had chased away with a pitchfork flashed into her mind. But she quickly pushed her thoughts away, trying not to think of such horrifying things. As he crawled into bed beside her, John turned his gaze to his beautiful wife and smiled a toothy smile. Then Anna caught between her husband's teeth a piece of flowered fabric from her own dress, and she immediately realized why her husband went to the woods so often. John was in fact a werewolf. The late October sun cast a soft orange glow over the rugged peaks of the mountain as Emily tightened the straps on her backpack. The day had been long but exhilarating. Crisp air, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, and the solitude of the wilderness gave her a sense of peace that only hiking alone could offer. At 25, Emily had developed a love for hiking as a form of escape from the demands of her busy life. She was a journalist, often working the whole week, not only on work days. She was young and she could do it, but in the nature she could clear her mind, let go of her worries, and reconnect with herself. As she made her way up the trail, dusk began to settle in. She knew she should start heading back to camp soon, but the trail ahead seemed so inviting. Just 1 more kilometer, she thought. The scenery was breathtaking, with towering pine trees and the occasional glimpse of distant mountains fading into twilight. But as she walked, the once peaceful woods took a different atmosphere in the dimming light. Shadows stretched longer and the forest grew eerily quiet. A sudden rustling sound broke the silence. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. She scanned the trees but saw nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, she thought, trying to calm herself. But a nagging sense of unease crept in. She had been hiking these trails for years and knew that the wilderness could be unpredictable, especially at night. Continuing cautiously, Emily rounded a bend in the trail and nearly collided with someone standing in the middle of the path. She gasped and took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. It was an old man. He stood hunched over slightly, his grey bird unkempt, wearing a faded flannel shirt and hiking boots that looked well worn. His face was edged with deep lines, his eyes hollow and tired. Emily's initial shock was quickly replaced by a chill that ran down her spine. There was something off about him, something that set her instincts on edge. "Didn't mean to startle you," the old man said, his voice raspy but calm. "No, it's okay," Emily stammered, her mind racing. What was an old man doing out here alone at this time of the night? She forced a polite smile, trying to keep her fear in check. The man stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said quietly. "It's not safe." Emily swallowed hard. The unease she had been feeling all day now morphed into a tangible fear. Was he warning her or threatening her? Her eyes flicked to the woods around her, calculating how quickly she could get away if she needed to. "I know," she said, her voice shaking. "I was just heading back to my campsite." The man nodded but didn't move. His eyes seemed distant, as if he were lost in a memory. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the straps of her pack. "Where are you headed?" she asked, hoping to deflect his attention and give herself an excuse to walk away. "Nowhere in particular," he replied, his voice low. "I like to walk these trails at night. Been doing it for years." He paused, then added softly, "Ever since the accident." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't ask what accident he was referring to, but she could see the pain in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. Something had happened to this man, something terrible. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said gently, turning away from him. I should really be getting back now. The man's gaze sharpened suddenly. Be careful out there, he said, his tone urgent. There are things in these woods that you can't always see coming. Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. She turned and hurried down the trail, feeling the man's eyes on her back until she rounded a corner and was out of sight. Her mind was racing with questions. Who was he? What had happened to him? And why did he seem so strange? As night fully descended, the temperature dropped and the darkness closed in around her. The shadows of the trees loomed taller, and the silence of the forest pressed against her ears. Emily quickened her pace, her breath coming in shallow bursts. And then she heard it, a long growl. Her blood froze. Slowly she turned her head to the side, scanning the trees. The sound came again, closer this time. Her heart pounded as she saw movements in the underbrush. A bear, a large dark shape lungering out of the shadows. Panic surged through her. She had read about bear encounters, knew what to do in theory, but none of that knowledge seemed useful now as the massive creature emerged, his eyes locked on her. Emily's mind screamed for her to run, but she knew better. Running would trigger the bear's predatory instinct. Instead, she slowly backed away, trying to make herself appear non-threatening, her breath hitching with each step. But the bear wasn't retreating. It was coming closer, its growls deep and menacing. In a sudden terrifying moment, the bear lunged. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing, and fell hard onto the ground. She tried to scramble away, but the bear was on her, its massive claws swiping dangerously close. She raised her arms to shield herself, certain that this was the end. Then, out of nowhere, the old man appeared. He moved with a speed and strength that belied his age, wielding a large branch like a weapon. He swung it at the bear, shouting loudly, drawing the animal's attention away from Emily. The bear roared in response, swiping at the man, but he didn't back down. With another swing, he stuck the bear across its muzzle. The creature hesitated for a moment, then retreated into the woods with a final guttural growl. Emily lay there trembling, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened, how close she had come to death, and how this strange haunted man had saved her life. She struggled to her feet, her legs shaking. "Thank you," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. You saved me." The old man turned to her, his eyes tired but calm. "You should get back to your camp," he said softly. "Don't stay out here any longer." I don't know how to thank you," Emily stammered, overwhelmed by what had just happened. The man gave her a sad smile, then turned and walked away into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. Emily stood there for a long moment, trying to process everything. She finally made her way back to her campsite, her mind swirling with confusion and gratitude. Who was that man, and why had he helped her? The next morning, as she packed up her gear and headed back to town, Emily couldn't shake the memory of the old man and the bear attack. When she stopped at a small cafe to grab breakfast and a newspaper, her eyes caught a headline that sent a chill through her. "Car accident leaves family dead, driver hospitalized." The article described a horrific crash that had occurred late last night. A car had veered off the road near the town, killing a family of 4. The only survivor was the driver, a man who had been badly injured and was now in critical condition at the local hospital. The name of the driver jumped out at her: Alexander Jones. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. That was the name the old man had given her, Alexander Jones. She hurried to the hospital, needing answers. When she asked the nurse at the front desk about Alexander Jones, the woman frowned and checked her records. "I'm sorry," the nurse said quietly. "Mr. Jones passed away during the night. He never regained consciousness after the accident." Emily stared at the nurse, her mind reeling. How could that be possible? She had seen him, talked to him. He had saved her life. As she walked out of the hospital, her thoughts raced. Had she really encountered Alexander Jones' ghost that night? A man who had lost his family in a car accident years ago, only to meet a similar fate? She couldn't explain it, but deep down she knew one thing for certain. Alexander Jones had saved her life, whether he was living or not. And now, as she looked back at the dark, mysterious woods, she felt a strange sense of peace.